In October last year, Prime Minister Keir Starmer ordered a review into alleged anti-Semitism within the NHS. This was after a handful of high-profile accusations of anti-Semitism were made against NHS staff, which the government claimed drew stark attention to problems of culture and the regulation in the health system. The final report has now been published, and its author, the government's independent advisor on anti-Semitism, John Mann, started by addressing the evidence base for the review, referencing a report he co-authored for the Board of Deputies alongside former Tory MP Penny Mordaunt. The Commission on Anti-Semitism stated that they had identified a specific unaddressed issue of anti-Semitism in the NHS, although I couldn't find any published evidence for this claim in the report. Nevertheless, the review covered not just anti-Semitism, but all forms of racism, and the government has been given 7 recommendations. Holding trusts accountable through the publication of a new NHS staff standard focused on tackling racism, setting minimum expectations for how organisations must prevent, respond to, and learn from incidents of racism. Mandatory anti-racism training, specifically including anti-Semitism, for the chairs and chief executives of all NHS provider trusts within 6 months. Updating mandatory training on equality, diversity, and human rights, accessed by 1.5 million staff, to include quality-assured content on anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim hostility. NHS adopting the 7 anti-racism principles of the NHS Race and Health Observatory and encouraging all NHS organisations to do so. Clear national guidance on uniform and NHS-issued equipment to ensure patients can access care with confidence, free from any perception of bias, and how trusts should respond to racist behaviour from the public. And setting out a single set of national guidance for employers, clearly defining employers' responsibilities and tackling discrimination incidents, and providing guidance and examples of the types of incidents that may require a regulatory referral. What surprised me is that a lot of these recommendations are things that I assumed the NHS already did, having an anti-racism strategy and mandatory anti-racism training for staff, something I don't think anyone here would object to. There was one recommendation, though, that the NHS has been put under scrutiny for, however, and it's around the national guidance on uniform. Here is the report's author, John Mann, expanding on what that meant on Sky News this morning.
Including, for example, no political badges being allowed to be worn, is that right?
Indeed. If I'm sat in the dentist chair and the dentist's about to drill my teeth, I don't expect the dentist to have political badges on. Even, I'm in the Labour Party, even a Labour Party badge, I might like that, but you might not like it. That's not appropriate. And so a badge that says I support Palestine, or indeed a badge that says I support Israel, I don't want my dentist to be wearing that when they're about to drill my teeth. And it's very straightforward policy, and I think that should be and will be the policy across the NHS. Get the political politicking out of the NHS, out of the hospital and health environment, because what Jewish patients have told me, and I've spoken to very large numbers, is that's more than off-putting. That's sometimes stopping people from using the NHS.
There's this legal action that some NHS workers are bringing against Bart's NHS Trust in London over that ban. And they are worried that it disproportionately affects people who are trying to express pro-Palestinian views or empathy with the suffering that they are seeing in Gaza. I mean, what would you say to that?
We might disproportionately impact Labour Party members if they're not wearing a Labour Party badge at work or any other political sloganing. Why would somebody in their employer's time dealing with patients want to be pushing their politics? If you want to have politics, I've got strong political views, I've been in politics all my life, then express them in your private life, express them as a private individual, but don't use the NHS to do it. Indeed, further, you shouldn't be using, and I've recommended this, the NHS logo and symbolism on your social media. Do it as yourself. Don't try and suggest the NHS is associated with whatever your views are, whether their views I would wholeheartedly agree with, or whether their views I regard as abhorrent. That's not inclusive, and it's not inclusive of the Jewish community, or indeed any other community, when you're doing that.
Wow, imagine being able to get access to an NHS dentist. I should be so lucky. What is interesting there is, I can understand at least somewhat of that sentiment there, that's just kind of a blanket ban on political symbols, regardless of what it is. But then again, where does the line come? And also on top of this, why now? Why is it this that's the one that has pushed things over the edge, right? People have worn things like the pride flag on their NHS lanyards, for example. They've shown solidarity with Ukraine, for example. And no one's brought up the nature of depoliticizing the NHS in terms of something like that. What about the Union Jack? What about the poppy? It'll be very, very funny if this government ends up having to legislate that the NHS should ban people wearing the poppy, because it is a political symbol. Like, you can't depoliticize the poppy. It's about war, right? I personally don't think it's a problem. But this legislation, or this change in NHS guidance, if it is about actually in the spirit of what he's saying here, banning all political symbols, it would ban the Union Jack and the poppy in those regards, right? Because the flag of Palestine is just any country's flag. And why should our flag be any different under that metric? Now, another part of the report's recommendations on uniform policy was around the wearing of medical attire outside of work, which was discussed on Radio 4 this morning by John Mann when speaking with Amal Rajan.
Why do you also want to ban NHS staff wearing, for instance, their scrubs on political protests? And can I ask, would that extend to political protests that aren't just about Israel and Palestine and Gaza, but about other issues like, for instance, again, LGBTQ rights?
Where there's a political process, and I've used the term political marches, where there's a political march, then the NHS imagery, the NHS branding, the NHS logo shouldn't be used as part of that.
Like on a Black Lives Matter protest?
If people want to have their own protests and be politically active in their own time, it's perfectly valid as a human right. I hope people would be politically active and having their own views. But taking the NHS into that and using the NHS into that is in my view a problem. My recommendation to the NHS is, in their policies, they should be saying that there's a differentiation when you're representing the NHS. I give an example. On your social media profile, should you have the NHS branding and logo on your social media profile if you're spouting off whatever you want to spout? Political views might be the political views that I share. No, you shouldn't. That doesn't stop you having a political view and expressing those views. That separation of the NHS and people's viewpoints, I think, has become a problem.
Yeah, you're not allowed to go to that protest on your walk home from work. You must get home and change first before you potentially bring the NHS into a political discussion. Now, this seems really far-reaching as far as I'm concerned, that you're not allowed to go to a protest if you're wearing your work attire. Like, that seems like really heavy-handed in terms of the depoliticization of the NHS. And on top of this, on your social media profile, you can't even mention you work for the NHS. Like, should that be in your professional capacity? Like, I'd say I work for Novara Media. Should be politicizing Novara Media? That makes no sense to me. That makes no sense to me that somehow mentioning that you're an NHS worker on your Twitter profile, for example, would therefore make you unable to make political statements on your own personal capacity whilst potentially being linked to your tenure with the NHS. That makes no sense. Now, as far as I'm concerned, if people want to make arguments for the depoliticization of the NHS, by all means, go right ahead. It's the case for many private businesses that staff leave their politics at the door. The issue I have is the fact that this depoliticization is being justified by reports on anti-Semitism, and that furthers the narrative that there is something inherently anti-Semitic about pro-Palestinian advocacy, even if the author never intended for that to be the case, of course. Now, take this call into LBC this morning, for example.
You need to understand they are there purely for your care, and there shouldn't be an environment where even politics comes into it, left wing or right wing. So I agree, it has to be a blanket ban, and that's already covered by the Equality Act. They don't need to create any new laws to do so.
But this recommendation, of course, would be that is what Lord Mann is calling for, though, Katie.
Yeah.
Because of those concerns.
Absolutely, because unfortunately we have scores of examples where people go into labour and they are faced in a very situation of obviously utmost sensitivity and in their most vulnerable hour, and they are faced with midwives who are covered in kafirs and pro-Palestine insignias, and that's incredibly upsetting, and it creates a hostile environment. That's ultimately illegal. It shouldn't be done. And I think the same for schools. I think many places should just be whether or not you're a customer or a patient, you need to feel that you are getting the best treatment.
See what I mean? So when people were wearing things like Ukraine solidarity badges when they were working in the NHS, right? No one was claiming, oh, well, this means that you must support Stepan Bandera. You must be someone who agrees with right sector and the Azov battalion, None of those claims were being made at the time. But, pro-Palestinian, oh, well, then that must be a hostile environment. You're upsetting to people by showing solidarity with Palestine. Ukraine, perfectly fine. Palestine, no, that's where we draw the line. I even saw a story where somebody was accused of supporting Hamas for wearing a keffiyeh patterned lanyard. That's the level to which that this insinuation that somehow there is an anti-Semitism problem because of the ability to show political symbology at work, that I find the problem here. Again, totally separate argument for depoliticization of the NHS, by all means. I would disagree. I think that, in my mind, I think it's fine to show political symbols at work, right? But if they're going to blanket ban everything, including the poppy, including the Union Jack, on grounds of being political, then by all means, you go ahead. That's not my opinion, but you're well within your right to advocate that. But making this a discussion around the anti-Semitic nature, for example, of potential badges or uniform choices, it lends credence to a narrative that pretends that there is something innately hostile about seeing somebody showing Palestinian solidarity, which that caller clearly into LBC had got the idea of. That's, to me, the way in which that is manifested in terms of people's reaction to this report and this ban. Dalia, what did you make of what we saw there?
Yeah, I think you're completely right in the sense that the timing of it, the context of it, it's very, very clear that this is not about, keeping politics out of the NHS. That is about keeping a specific kind of politics out of everything, out of trying to drive pro-Palestinian politics out of public life, because there is a sense that, this argument has gotten away. And, the sentiment has changed, the public mood has changed, so they're trying to put it back in the box. Now, when it comes to the NHS, I think, and we often say, there is this problem where it's displaying the Palestinian flag or expressing solidarity with Palestine, it's very, very problematic to equivocate that with anti-Semitism. And that not only makes Palestinians less safe and stigmatizes Palestinians, but it makes Jewish people less safe as well. I would say, and there's a sense of okay, well, just because you feel a certain way about this symbol does not mean that that feeling can override the reality that obviously believing in rights that Palestinians should not be subjected to a genocide is not coming from a place of bigotry. I do think that there is an interesting point here to be made, which is that in the particular environment of, a medical appointment or an interaction with a healthcare professional, I can see an argument for why there should be a blanket ban. Because I don't generally believe in this in most other contexts, in most other workplaces. But, when someone is in a healthcare setting, I can see an argument to be made for the idea that the medical professional should try to be a blank canvas. Because even if they are wearing something that makes a patient feel a certain way, and even if the way the patient feels is, something that I would say is not rooted in reality, how a patient feels in a medical setting is important to the level of medical care that they get. Because, a patient being able to be open, to be vulnerable with a medical health professional is important. So I can see an argument for why there should be a complete blanket ban on literally any kind of anything other than your scrubs, that it literally should just be you're wearing a uniform and everyone is indistinguishable from one another. The idea that outside of the workplace, wearing NHS branded things or wearing your scrubs and going on a demo should be banned, that has got nothing to do with the question of delivery of healthcare to a patient. And there are many reasons why someone who is in the NHS would want to wear their scrubs on a pro-Palestine demonstration, not least because 1,700 of their colleagues, Palestinian doctors, have been murdered in Gaza, not least because Israel has been targeting hospitals specifically. So there is a particular political reason why a healthcare professional in this country, why, the BMJ has, condemned the murdering of Palestinian doctors, is because that it is a political point. It is a political situation and a political decision that Israel has made to destroy the health infrastructure of Gaza. So it makes complete sense that healthcare workers here would want to express solidarity with that. And despite, this is a very, very cynical timing and very cynical context, and it is very much to try and stigmatize the Palestinian flag, to stigmatize things that represent solidarity with Palestine, to suggest that there's something inherently nefarious about it, which is in itself not only Islamophobic, not only anti-Palestinian racism, but is also anti-Semitic. But separately from that, I can understand an argument why there should be a blanket ban on any kind of symbols within the specific place of a healthcare setting. But let's not be delusional about where this particular intervention at this moment is coming from.
What was really confusing to me as well, I was looking into the report from the Board of Deputies that was co-authored by John Mann and Penny Mordaunt there. And I could not find anything that actually showed kind of quantitatively why there was such a specific problem in the NHS. We found that there was a problem in the NHS. I'm like, more than the rest of society? In the report that John Mann made to the government that I read through, I was like, oh, well, among Jewish personnel in the NHS, they have seen the instances of them being on the receiving end of racism has gone up. And I'm like, well, that's gone up across society, right? That's a wider reflection of the continued increase in levels of anti-Semitism broadly across society, which we have seen.
And the rise of the far right.
And indeed the rise of the far, 100%, 100%. So the idea that somehow there is an NHS-specific problem here, I have not seen this evidence at all. I think it's just, again, it seems very weird to me. It seems very strange that for some reason, the NHS has become this focal point for discussing anti-Semitism, so much so the government commissions an entire report based upon this thing that was commissioned by the BOD from 2024, I believe, where they just said, problem in the NHS. And then, as far as I can see, I mean, if someone knows where the data is and they want to provide it to me, be my guest, I'd love to see it. But I couldn't find it.
And it's just, you can't draw a line from like, there has been an increase in anti-Semitism in the NHS, which I'm willing to hear. I'm open to hearing like how and why and what that looks like. But you're saying that, and then you're going straight to, I don't want to see people wearing Palestine pins on their scrubs. And it's like, so what you're saying is that a Palestinian flag is inherently anti-Semitic. So you're saying that like the existence of a place called Palestine and the existence of a people called Palestine is inherently nefarious.
Yeah, again,
make it make sense.
Make it exactly 100%. It doesn't make any sense at all to me.